This really happened to me, and I'll never forget it as long as I live. The cuffs were cold against my wrists, the steel biting into my skin as the flashing red and blue lights painted the cracked pavement of the motel parking lot. I wasn't even sure which part of me hurt more, the shock of being yanked to the ground or the realization that my own family had put me here. My cousin's smug grin glimmered in the reflection of the cruiser's headlights, and in that moment, with gravel cutting into my cheek, I understood something awful. I'd been framed for a murder I didn't commit. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel. Tell us where you're from and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else's business. By the time I turned 57, I had carved out a modest, steady life. Nothing flashy, nothing criminal, just a man trying to make it through with a little dignity. That night, though, with the cruiser door slamming shut beside me, my entire existence tilted on its axis. I couldn't even process it fully. The accusation, the betrayal, the evidence stacked so perfectly against me, as if someone had rehearsed every detail to ensure I had no way out. And in the middle of it all, my own relatives smiling in the shadows. The days that followed blurred together in the most humiliating haze of my life. I was dragged into the downtown Cleveland Justice Center, paraded in front of people who whispered and shook their heads, as if they had always known I was capable of something monstrous. Reporters snapped photos like vultures circling a carcass, and through it all, I felt stripped, bear-like. They weren't just accusing me of murder, but of being the very worst version of myself that I never was. When I finally sat alone in that holding cell, I started replaying every conversation, every family gathering, every offhand remark that now seemed sharpened with hidden meaning. My cousin Eddie, who had always looked at me with this quiet envy when my business did better than his. My niece Karen, who seemed too eager to whisper gossip when I showed up with a new truck, and my brother-in-law Tom, the kind of man who smiled with his teeth but never with his eyes. Something in my gut twisted, telling me that these people had built the noose tightening around my neck. The lawyer they assigned me was some overworked public defender who barely looked up from his files. "The evidence is stacked high," he said flatly, tapping the photos of blood-stained fabric and a discarded revolver that bore my fingerprints. I didn't even own a revolver. But the way he spoke, it was like he'd already written me off, like my life wasn't worth more than a half-hearted argument in front of a judge. Nights in the cell dragged on endlessly, broken only by the sound of distant shouts, the clank of keys, the stale smell of bleach and sweat. I lay there staring at the ceiling, thinking about how quickly trust can curdle into betrayal, how people you shared meals with could stab you deeper than any stranger. I tried to think of the victim, someone I knew only distantly, a man named Carl from the old neighborhood who had gotten mixed up in shady deals. And then I remembered Eddie had once borrowed money from him. Suddenly puzzle pieces began shifting in my mind, forming edges to a picture I hadn't yet fully seen. But the thought that gnawed at me most wasn't about Carl or Eddie or the trial that loomed. It was about the sickly sweet satisfaction I had glimpsed on my cousin's face that night. That look of triumph. That was the spark. That was the moment when shame turned into something else inside me. Something colder, sharper, more dangerous. The humiliation was unbearable. But what I didn't know yet was that it would also become my fuel. And the longer I stayed caged, the more I began to shape a single thought into a weapon. If I ever got out, I would make them pay. The cell door clanged open one night, and a guard's gruff voice pulled me from my spiral of thoughts. "You got visitors," he said. My stomach nodded instantly. Visitors could mean anyone: lawyers, family, police. But the thought of seeing one of their faces on the other side of the glass made me clench my fists so tight, my nails dug into my palms. And when I sat down and saw who it was, my whole world shifted again. It was Karen, my niece. She slid into the chair on the other side of the scratched plexiglass divider, her blonde hair pinned up too neatly, her lips painted too bright for someone visiting, a relative accused of murder. For a moment I thought maybe, just maybe, she was here to apologize, or at least to reassure me that the family would stand by my side. But then she leaned forward, her eyes flicking toward the guard behind me, and smiled. "You look terrible, Uncle," she said softly, almost like she was savoring the words. I clenched my jaw so hard I thought my teeth might crack. "Why are you here, Karen?" She tilted her head, that smug little smile tugging at her lips. "Just wanted to see how you're holding up. Everyone's talking about you. You're famous now." Can you imagine 57 years old and you finally made headlines? My pulse pounded in my ears. I wanted to reach through the glass and shake the truth out of her. "You know damn well I didn't do this." Karen leaned back, folding her arms like she was watching a show she'd already seen. "Maybe you didn't, but the evidence says otherwise. And honestly, who do you think the jury's gonna believe, you or everyone else who's lining up to point the finger?" Her words settled into my gut like poison. That's when I realized she wasn't just involved, she was enjoying it. This was entertainment to her. The guard tapped his watch. Signaling time was almost up. Karen smirked and whispered, "Don't worry, Uncle. Well, take care of things while you're away. You just relax." The phone clicked dead, and she walked out, leaving me shaking with rage. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass, my fists balled tight. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just some tragic accident or a misunderstanding. This was deliberate, calculated. They wanted me destroyed. The trial was set for the Cuyahoga County Court of Common Pleas, a gray looming fortress of stone that I'd only ever passed by in my life, never imagining I'd be dragged through its doors as a defendant. When the day came, the city was gray too, clouds pressed low over Cleveland drizzle, misting the streets, a chill that got into your bones. My lawyer shuffled beside me, carrying a battered briefcase that seemed older than me. I stepped into the courtroom, and there they were, Eddie, Karen, and Tom, sitting together in the gallery, dressed too nicely, whispering to each other with sly grins. The prosecution painted me like some bitter old man, with debts and grudges, someone who had finally snapped and killed Carl in a fit of rage. They waved around photos of the revolver, the bloody fabric, the eyewitness statements that seemed to point directly at me. I wanted to scream that it was all lies, but my lawyer just shook his head every time I opened my mouth. When Eddie took the stand, I nearly lunged out of my seat. He put on this pitiful act, his voice shaking, claiming he'd seen me arguing with Carl the night before the murder. He said Carl had confided in him, that I was dangerous, unpredictable. And the way he told it, the jury nodded along, eating it up like it was gospel. I sat there, my hands gripping the edge of the defense table, staring daggers at him. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Coward days bled into weeks. The trial dragged on, and each time I looked over at my so-called family, I saw the satisfaction in their faces. They thought they had won. They thought they'd buried me alive. And when the verdict finally came back guilty, I thought my heart had stopped. Life in prison. At 57 years old, it might as well have been a death sentence. But here's the thing about cages. They don't always kill the fire inside you. Sometimes they concentrate it. I spent every hour of every day in that cell, turning over the puzzle pieces, replaying the lies, the smirks, the evidence that had been too perfect. I started writing things down, keeping a notebook of every detail I remembered, every inconsistency, every scrap of conversation, and slowly, a picture started forming. Eddie had debts. Serious debts. I remembered whispers about loan sharks about him, owing Carl money. Karen had always hung on Eddie's arm doing his dirty work. And Tom. He was the type to orchestrate, to pull strings from the shadows. The more I pieced together, the clearer it became. They had needed a scapegoat, and I had been the easiest target. But I wasn't going to stay their scapegoat forever. One night, lying awake in my bunk, I whispered a promise to myself. If I ever found a way out, any way out, I'd hunt them down one by one. Not with fists, not with guns, but with something sharper, with truth, with revenge that cut deeper than anything they could imagine. And that chance came sooner than I expected. My lawyer filed an appeal, not because he believed in me, but because it was routine. Months passed, and then, almost miraculously, a shred of doubt surfaced. A surveillance tape from a convenience store near the crime scene showed a figure that wasn't me, leaving the area around the time of the murder. It wasn't conclusive, but it was enough to crack the door open. After a grueling fight, my conviction was overturned on a technicality pending a retrial. I walked out of prison 2 years later, thinner, harder, and filled with a fury that burned hotter than anything I'd ever felt. I didn't tell anyone. I was free. Not Eddie, not Karen, not Tom. I slipped back into the city like a ghost, staying in a cheap motel near East Cleveland, keeping to myself. I watched. I listened. I began to move pieces on the board, slowly, carefully. The hunter had been born, and the first step was simple: make them believe their victory was still intact. So I started with silence. I moved like a shadow. 2 years behind bars teaches you how to make yourself small, how to listen until the air gives up its secrets. I found a cheap room over a laundromat on Woodland Avenue and spent my days like a ghost, watching the people who had celebrated my downfall. I watched Eddie's battered Chevy roll past the motel window every morning at exactly 712. I traced Karen's Instagram posts, noting the restaurants she favored: La Dolce Vita on Shaker Square, the boutique coffee shop on Bellflower, and the faces she liked. I learned their rhythms, their lazy arrogance, the small indulgences that made them think themselves untouchable. You learn useful things when you stop talking and start watching. For instance, people who conspire become sloppy when they're convinced they won. They recycle the same lies, they slip into old habits, and they assume the world has forgotten the small details that tie them to their sin. My job was to find those details and make them unbearable. My first real break came from a bartender named Rico at a dim bar on Detroit Avenue, Seventh Sun Brewing, which knows how to pour a cold beer, and will talk if you let it. I'd been sitting there 3 nights in a row, nursing a soda and pretending to read a crumpled paperback, when Rico slid a napkin across the counter with a name scrawled on it: Tom Marlowe Trust, Fund Party, Edgewater. Saturday, 8 p.m. He didn't ask why I wanted to know. He had seen the look in my eyes. People trust bartenders with secrets because bartenders aren't judges, they're witnesses. Rico liked me enough after 2 nights of stiff questions and tipping for extra olives. He liked the idea of watching a man take back what was stolen. Edgewater Park was one of those places where the city's money pretended to be casual. That Saturday, the lake glittered under a false civility: men in linen jackets, women in dresses like they were about to be photographed for a magazine that never existed, Tom stood at the center of it all, like a conductor smiling, shaking hands, clinking glasses. I drifted among the crowd, as if I belonged in easy face, with a story nobody wanted to ask about. I filmed him from across the lawn, with my phone, careful not to tilt it, so the angle would scream intentionality. Slow, patient surveillance, collect the image, the voice, the warmth of his cigarette embers pocketed in the shadow of his suit. The people at Tom's party talked business, charity, and insurance. I heard names and dates passing like litmus tests. I paid attention to every half phrase that could lead me down a corridor, a developer complaining about unpaid loans, a mention of Carl's problem, then laughter like a door closing. I recorded it all. I learned later that audio tape and shaky video were garbage in court, unless you could place them beside a paper trail. But they made people nervous once you showed them to the right prosecutor or the right friend who had a conscience. Evidence is an ecosystem. You plant one seed and watch what grows. Between watching and waiting, I stalked their electronic footprints. I rented a small anonymous P.O. box in Lakewood and set up burner emails. I learned how to ask the right questions of institutions without sounding like a lunatic. Which bank holds a trust account? Who signed off on a payee? What lawyer filed? What paperwork? That's dry work, numbing and precise, but it slowly stitched a map. Bank transfers are the sort of thing relatives forget when they are drunk on victory. Large sums moved through accounts owned by shell companies, with addresses linked to Tom's real estate firm. A $25,000 deposit here, a wire to a consultant there. I saved screenshots, dates, amounts. I learned that money leaves fingerprints the same way. Men leave fingerprints on a revolver they never owned. I needed a name that meant something to a prosecutor. So I found to hack the courthouse filings for the last 5 years. Tom liked to sue people for nuisance or nuisance-adjacent grievances. Property lines, small business disputes always resolved quietly. Those documents showed his lawyers, stationery, P.O. boxes, phone numbers. That lawyer's paralegal had a Gmail account that was confusingly lax with attachments. I wasn't proud of the ways I bent the rules to get inside other people's sloppy digital lives. I only cared about the result. The paralegal's inbox had a forwarded email with a spreadsheet attached, weekly accounting Q3, that had a line item I never expected. Carl pay off Eddie $12,000, Karen expense $1,200. I printed it off at a library in University Circle and read it until the letters blurred. The spreadsheet didn't accuse anyone in words. This is the thing. Con men understand the truth can be committed in numbers. A ledger is a confession to someone who reads it without the need for drama. That line in between office supplies and miscellaneous consultant fees connected my cousin to the man they said I had killed. It wasn't enough to scream from the rooftops. It was enough to begin a quiet, methodical squeeze. I started by planting doubt small things a prosecutor or a judge might notice, but not act on. At first, I mailed anonymous tipped envelopes to a reporter at the Cleveland Plain dealer, with copies of the spreadsheet and the backyard photographs from Tom's Edgewater party that showed clearly Tom conferring with Eddie and a man I recognized from Carl's circle. The reporter filed them away. Reporters like physical things. Touchable proof. He called me once from a blocked number to ask where I got the materials I didn't answer. Journalists are predators. Leave them a bone, and they will gnaw until something juicy bleeds. I also went to the DA's intake office with a folder that smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and cheap soap. I walked in like a citizen, nervous about a neighborhood squabble, and asked for a public records clerk. They sat me down in a windowless room, and I spread the spreadsheet, the photos, and a copy of the convenience store footage that had originally cracked a hole in my conviction. The clerk nodded, made notes. She told me the right words. We can't act on anonymous tips. So I left my card, which had a fake name, and the folder. Bureaucracies are slow, but they have a certain hunger for cases with threads they can pull. Meanwhile, Eddie remained a slug of human resentment. He still drank at a dive off Lorraine Avenue, where the light bulbs hung like sad moons. I went there twice and sat in the corner where he couldn't see me listening. He bragged to a young man about the clean job they'd done, how they'd put my prints on the weapon by having someone handle it, where I had once visited a gun range years ago, how the prosecution filled in the rest. He said carelessly, "Tom covered the buy-off, Karen handled the cleanup." That offhand confession would have been a dream for a jury if it had been recorded in a way a court accepts. I left with my throat dry and my hands trembling. The voice on the tape would make them tremble too. I tricked my way into capturing it. I watched Eddie one night as he left the bar, followed him into a parking garage, and when he bent over his trunk to shove in a case of beer, I slipped up behind him and hit record on my phone with the mic pointed. The kind of recording that picks up breath, the rattling of keys, the casual cruelty in a man who thinks nobody will ever listen. He talked to someone on the phone. Tom, I guessed, about getting the last parts in place, and mentioned a lawyer who cleared the paperwork. I held my breath and kept the device steady, even when my hands shook. The clip was messy, full of static and muffled phrases, but it had the cadence of confession. It had the nails. There was one more smart move I made that felt like stepping over a ledge. I sought legal counsel of my own, someone who didn't blink when I said I had evidence, but wanted to remain anonymous for the time being. A former prosecutor named Jenny Hargrove had moved into private practice and kept a reputation for not being sentimental. I approached her under the pretense of asking about a hypothetical. If a man were framed, and if his relatives were involved, how would one proceed? She asked the right questions like a surgeon mapping a body. When I laid out the spreadsheet, the recordings, the Edgewater photos, she stopped pretending this was hypothetical. Her eyes narrowed. "If this is what you say, then you have something," she said. "But you don't walk into court with ragged tapes and hearsay. We build a dossier. We find witnesses. We show a pattern." Jenny became my slow mover, my link to the world that could actually punish them. She spoke the language of subpoenas and discovery of chain of custody and cross-examination. But she also said something I hadn't expected. Men like Tom suffer most when their reputations crack. They have allies who will abandon them if the story gets hot enough. She advised patience. "Make them expose themselves," she said. "Don't try to burn down the house with a match start, a leak, and watch it rot." So I started leaks. I scraped together names of Tom's investors and quietly emailed them a package. The spreadsheet, the Edgewater photos, a summary of the possible legal exposure. People whose money is in someone's hands prefer quiet divorces to public scandals, and one by one, I watched the calls begin. There were no explosions, rather 1,000 small rustles as people shifted their positions, as Tom got nervous and made the mistake of checking his accounts in ways he hadn't before. Money is the first thing conspirators forget to guard, but I couldn't simply wait for the world to do the work. I needed a piece of proof that would make a jury lean in an admission. And of all the people who smelled of guilt, it was Karen who had the habit of talking too loudly when she felt safe. She liked to play the fiddle of self-invention, helping at charity drives, posting herself at acoustic nights, pretending that pretense was authenticity. People like her think themselves clever because they dress like belonging. They tell stories to make themselves heroes. On a humid Thursday in August, I found her at a late-night rehearsal at a small club on East 4th Street. She always sang before the curtain, a practiced vulnerability that made men lean forward and women look away. I blended in with the crowd, ordered a tepid coffee, and waited. During a break, she slipped outside for a cigarette and some air, and she wasn't alone. Eddie was there. Shoulders hunched, voice low. I edged closer and slipped my phone into my palm, recording from my pocket, pretending I was reading a text. They spoke in half phrases, but Karen laughed sharp and bright, as if she had struck a match. "We did what had to be done," she said. "He was going to find out about the transfers. He would have ruined everything." Eddie huffed. "We gave him a good show. The gun, the fabric, the prints. Jenny." The DA all lined up. There was a pause, a small intake of breath, and Karen added almost as an afterthought. "Tom said it'd be cleaner if he got locked up. Easier to keep the money in the family when he's out of the way." My hands went cold. The recording caught the syllables, like a net. For the first time since the handcuffs bit into my wrists, that motel night, I felt a wind in my favor. I could hear the gears in my head turning, how to move this to Jenny, to the DA, to the press in the right order, so the house of cards fell without giving them time to whisper their way out of it. Slipped out of the club, the night air heavy with the city's heat and the metallic promise of something about to change. I didn't notice the siren until it was close, and then the lights flashed over the pavement in the distance like a warning. As I walked back to the motel, the recording snug in my pocket, I felt for the first time what I had been denying myself, the exact shape of the revenge he'd promised. It wasn't about violence. It was about reconstruction. Bring the truth into rooms where they couldn't pretend their innocence. I sent the clip to Jenny at 2:14 a.m., blind and desperate, with a note that said only, "Listen." Now she called me at 3:02. Her voice was a whisper that had iron in it. "This is good," she said. "We can compel testimony. We can thaw their alibis. But if they sense you're behind this, if they tie it back to you, they'll run or they'll burn the files. We need to move fast." "Well, move fast," I said. "But we need one more thing. I need Tom to make a mistake big enough that his lawyer can't hide it. He's careful, too careful. He thinks money buys him a shield." Jenny paused. "Let them make the mistake themselves," she said. "Push a little. Give them a reason to panic. People panic when someone starts pulling on threads that smell like exposure. Your anonymous tips, the press, and a subpoena, if we can coordinate those, we get the whole show." I should have slept that morning. Instead, I sat on the edge of my bed and watched the sun pull its light into the neighborhood like a curtain. I closed my eyes and thought of the metal of the handcuffs on my wrists, of the cheap coffee in the holding cell, of Eddie's smug grin. I thought of Carl, and I whispered his name like a benediction. Then my phone buzzed with a single email from an address I didn't recognize. "We need to talk tonight, garage, behind, West 25th. Come alone if you want to hear something that'll finish this." The sender was anonymous. The subject line read audio files. My heart knocked like a hammer against the ribs of my chest. I stood up so fast the cheap motel chair scraped across the floor. I had spent months setting traps now. Someone who knew how to bring men down, had offered me the net. I tucked the phone into my jacket, picked up the folder of clippings and recordings, and walked out into the thick light of late afternoon, feeling the odd hollow thrill of something finally taking shape. At the corner of West 25th, the garage sat like a scab on the neighborhood corrugated metal, a hawk of old graffiti, a sliding door with a padlock. There was no sign of the person who'd written, only the smell of oil and the distant hiss of a city that never learns to be quiet. I considered turning back. Instead, I walked to the padlock, lifted it, and what I saw beyond the door made me freeze. There, on a battered folding table, lay a memory stick with a post-it play. My fingers trembled as I picked it up. I slid it into my phone, and for a second, just a second, the garage was filled with the sound of a voice I'd known my whole life. It was Eddie laughing, then Tom's voice. Well, pin it on him. Hell never see the trial coming. And then a second voice, my own faint, as if it had been recorded from another time and another place. My stomach dropped. I hit play again, leaning closer to the speakers, because I couldn't bear to trust my eyes. The recording was clearer than anything. I had a tape of a meeting in a room that smelled of whiskey, where the three of them, Tom, Eddie, Karen, discussed timelines, payments, and the neatness of a frame. At one point, someone said casually, "Hell be grateful when we sort his affairs out later." There was no ambiguity. There was only deliberate orchestration. I should have felt victorious. Instead, as the tape played on the garage door at the far side, scraped open. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. Someone else was there listening. My head snapped up. The recording cut off. The light in the garage shifted. A shape stepped from the shadow, and the voice that filled the air was a voice I had not expected to hear. Not in that place, not now. "Looking for evidence, are we?" the voice said. The voice was Tom's. He stepped into the half-light of the garage, his suit jacket too perfect for a place that stank of oil and rust, his shoes clicking against the concrete. He didn't flinch at finding me there. He looked almost pleased, like he had walked into a rehearsal he had scripted months ago. "I wondered how long it would take you to find this little collection," Tom said, nodding toward the memory stick still wedged in my phone. His smile was sharp, smug. "You've been busy watching, digging, poking your nose where it doesn't belong." I forced myself to breathe evenly, though my pulse hammered like a drumline. "That recording is enough to bury you." Tom chuckled, a low, dismissive sound. "Enough to raise questions, maybe. But you know as well as I do that questions aren't convictions, and even if you walked this into the DA's office tomorrow, they'd ask, where did it come from? Who brought it? Why now? Without context, it's just noise." He spread his hands like a magician, explaining a trick. I wanted to lunge at him to feel my hands around the throat of the man who had stolen years of my life. But I kept still. Rage wasn't my weapon anymore. Evidence was, "You made one mistake, Tom," I said quietly. "You thought I'd stay broken." For a second, something flickered in his eyes. Annoyance, amusement, fear, I couldn't tell. He took a step closer, his cologne sharp in the stale air. "You've got spirit. He'll give you that. But spirit doesn't win wars. Influence does, money does. And I have both." He leaned in, voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Walk away, App. Take what little life you've got left and disappear. Because if you keep pushing, you'll find out just how deep this rabbit hole goes." My throat tightened, but I refused to back down. "You framed me for murder, Tom. You stole my freedom. You made me watch my family spit on my name. I don't walk away from that, ever." His smile hardened into something cold. "Then you won't walk away at all." He turned, walking toward the back of the garage. A black SUV idled there, its engine humming. I caught a glimpse of Eddie in the driver's seat, his face pale, jittery. Karen sat in the back, her eyes locked on me through the window, like a predator sizing up its prey. For a heartbeat, fear clawed at my chest. It was 3 against 1. No lawyer here. No DA. No judge. Just concrete walls and silence. They could make me disappear, and nobody would know until my body washed up in the Cuyahoga River. But then, I remembered I wasn't unarmed. I slipped my hand into my jacket pocket, pressing my thumb against the tiny recorder hidden there. It had been running since the moment I stepped into the garage. Every word Tom had said, every threat, every arrogant boasted, was all captured. And this time, the chain of custody was mine. I straightened, forcing my voice to remain steady. "Thanks for the confession," I said. Tom froze. His head turned slowly, eyes narrowing as the weight of my words sank in. Karen leaned forward in the back seat, her mouth opening in shock. Eddie cursed under his breath, slamming his palm against the steering wheel. For the first time, I saw fear in Tom's face. I tucked the recorder deeper into my pocket, turned, and walked out of the garage into the fading light of evening. My legs felt like they might give out at any moment, but I kept moving every step, fueled by the knowledge that I finally had what I needed. The war had shifted. That night I met Jenny at her office, sliding the recorder across her desk. She listened, her expression unreadable, until Tom's voice filled the room with his threats. Then she leaned back, exhaling slowly. "This," she said, tapping the recorder with a manicured finger, "is enough to open doors." She explained how she would file motions, how she would pressure the DA to reopen the case, how she would line up the financial records with the audio evidence. "This is just about overturning your conviction anymore," she said. "This is about indicting them." But as she spoke, my mind wasn't on legal strategy. It was on Tom's words. "You'll find out how deep this rabbit hole goes," because I had the sickening sense he hadn't been bluffing. The next morning, I woke to the sound of my motel phone ringing, an ancient rotary thing that usually only buzzed when the front desk wanted payment. I picked it up, and a voice I didn't recognize hissed through the static. "They know you've got the tape. You need to move. Now." The line went dead. My stomach dropped. I yanked on my jacket, grabbed the folder of evidence, and bolted for the door. But when I stepped into the hallway, I froze. At the far end stood Eddie, his bulk filling the narrow space, a grin twisting his lips. Behind him, Karen leaned casually against the wall, twirling a set of car keys around her finger. "Morning, Uncle," she said sweetly. "Going somewhere." My blood went cold. The hallway felt like a coffin, narrow walls, faded wallpaper peeling in strips, and at one end, Eddie and Karen blocking my escape. Eddie's grin widened, his teeth yellow under the flickering fluorescent light. Karen's keys jingled softly, tauntingly, like a snake's rattle. I gripped the folder tighter under my arm. Recorder with Tom's threats was in my pocket, safe, but fragile. If they got their hands on me now, all of it would be gone. "Move," I said. My voice low measured. Eddie chuckled, stepping forward, his boots heavy against the thin carpet. "Or, what, you gonna fight me in front of all these doors? You think anyone here's gonna come running if they hear a little scuffle?" He spread his arms, filling the hallway with his bulk. "Face it, Ab. This is the end of the line." Karen tilted her head, her blonde hair catching the light. "We told you to disappear. You just don't listen, always so stubborn. Now we have to clean up the mess." I glanced at the doors on either side of me. Old warped wood tenants inside, maybe sleeping, maybe ignoring what they heard. People in places like this didn't call cops. They stayed quiet. Still, I needed chaos. Noise, anything to tilt the balance. I took a step forward, then another, my heart pounding. Eddie squared his shoulders, ready to lunge. At the last second, I snapped my elbow against the fire alarm mounted on the wall. The glass shattered, the alarm shrieked, and suddenly the entire building came alive with blaring sirens. Eddie cursed, covering his ears. Karen flinched, fumbling with her keys. Doors opened up and down the hallway, curious faces peeking out, shouts echoing. In that split second of confusion, I bolted. I shoved past Eddie, his hand grazing my shoulder, and sprinted down the stairs 2 at a time. The sirens wailed, smoke alarms flashing, people shouting as they spilled into the hall. I burst through the motel's front door and into the street, lungs burning, legs pumping. Behind me, I heard Karen scream my name, her voice cutting through the chaos like a knife I didn't stop. I ducked into an alley weaving through trash bins and broken pallets until I reached the main road. My chest heaved, sweat pouring down my face, but I kept moving. I couldn't go back to the motel. The evidence was all I had left. And now they knew I had it. I needed a safe place. Somewhere they wouldn't think to look Jenny. I pulled out my phone, hands shaking, and dialed her number. She picked up on the second ring. Ab. They know, I gasped. Eddie and Karen at the motel. I barely got out. I'm on the street heading your way. There was a pause. Then her voice snapped sharp. Don't come here. If they're following, you'll lead them right to me. Go to the Greyhound station, locker 23. He'll meet you there in an hour. I hung up, shoved the phone back in my pocket, and flagged down the first cab I saw. The driver barely looked at me as I slid into the back seat. Breathless and trembling, Greyhound station, I said. As we pulled away, I caught sight of a black SUV turning onto the road behind us. My stomach clenched. It was them. The cab driver muttered something about traffic as I slouched low in the seat, praying the SUV wouldn't follow. My mind raced. If Tom, Eddie, and Karen were desperate enough to confront me in broad daylight, they were losing control. That was good, but it also meant they were dangerous. The cab reached the station, a crumbling building on Chester Avenue that smelled of exhaust and stale coffee. I paid in cash, slipped inside, and found locker 23. My hands shook as I stashed the recorder and folder inside, locking it with a slam. My evidence was safe for now. Then I sat in the waiting area, surrounded by weary travelers and crying children, the buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. Every second felt like an hour. I scanned every face, every movement, waiting for them to appear. Finally, Jenny walked in her suit jacket draped over one arm, her hair pulled back, her eyes scanning until they landed on me. Relief flooded my chest. She sat beside me, her voice low. You did the right thing. We'll get the locker later. For now, we need to go somewhere safe. I nodded, swallowing hard. They're cracking Jenny. They came after me. That means they're scared. Jenny's gaze hardened. Good. That fear is leverage, but we have to be smart. One wrong move, and they'll twist it back on you. They've done it before. Before I could answer, a commotion erupted near the entrance. Shouts. The sound of something crashing. I turned, my blood running cold. Eddie had just walked into the station, his face red, his eyes locked on me. Karen was right behind him, and standing at the door, calm and collected, was Tom. Time's up, Ab. He called across the crowd, his voice carrying like a gavel strike. Jenny grabbed my arm. We run. Now Jenny's grip on my arm was like steel as she yanked me from the bench. We slipped into the stream of travelers weaving between duffel bags and rolling suitcases. The Greyhound station had turned into a chessboard. Every move calculated, every wrong step a checkmate. Tom stood at the door like a spider guarding the web, his eyes cool and unblinking. Eddie lumbered through the crowd, shoving people aside, his voice booming, Ab, don't make this harder than it has to be. Karen trailed just behind, her eyes darting, sharp and frantic. Jenny leaned in close. We need cover somewhere. They can't get to us without making a scene. My eyes scanned the terminal, past the ticket counters, past the bathrooms. Then I saw it, a police kiosk tucked near the far corner. 2 uniformed officers sipping coffee, half listening to their radios. That way, I hissed. We pushed through the crowd, the noise rising, people yelling at Eddie, someone cursing as Karen elbowed past Tom. Never raised his voice, he didn't have to. He just followed with that measured stride, certain he'd corner me. As we neared the kiosk, Jenny slowed her pace, slipping the recorder from her bag. She pressed it into my palm, her eyes sharp. Hold on to it. If we get separated, you run. You understand. Run. I nodded, though my stomach churned. Then chaos erupted. Eddie spotted us and charged. His bulk slammed through a luggage cart suitcases, spilling onto the floor. A child screamed. Karen shouted, "Hez dangerous! Hez got something! He's going to hurt someone!" Her voice cut through the air like a knife turning heads, making people recoil. She was trying to frame me again, right there in the open. But this time I was ready. I didn't run. I didn't hide. I raised the recorder high and shouted, my voice cracking but loud enough to echo. "They framed me. I have the proof right here. Listen to Tom's voice. Listen to what they did." Dozens of heads swiveled toward me. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The two officers at the kiosk straightened their hands, drifting to their belts. Tom froze mid-step, his mask slipping for the first time. Eddie hesitated, his momentum faltering. Karen's eyes widened in panic. Jenny grabbed the recorder from my hand, thrust it toward the officers and said firmly, "This contains a confession. These three framed my client for murder. If you don't act now, you'll be letting them escape again." The officers exchanged a look, then moved. One reached for the recorder. The other stepped toward Tom, Eddie, and Karen holding up a hand. "Let's all calm down here." But Eddie wasn't built for calm. He lunged at me, his fist cocked. The crowd screamed, scattering chairs, toppled. And in that explosion of noise, the truth finally spilled into the open, because the recorder was still playing. Tom's voice filled the station, loud and undeniable. "You framed me for murder, Tom. You stole my freedom." Then Tom's answer, "You won't walk away at all." The words echoed through the terminal like a verdict. Gasps erupted. People pulled out phones, recording, capturing the scene. The officers froze only for a moment, then surged forward. One tackled Eddie mid-swing, pinning him to the ground. The other grabbed Karen's arm as she shrieked, "It's fake, it's all fake." But her protests drowned beneath the roar of the recording. The crowds mutters the clicks of cameras, and Tomelway's so calm, so untouchable, simply stood there. His jaw clenched, his hands tightening at his sides. For the first time, he looked small, exposed. The officers barked into their radios, calling for backup. More uniforms flooded in, surrounding us, corralling the chaos. Jenny slipped the recorder back into her bag, her face composed, triumphant. "It's over," I said, my voice hoarse. Tom's eyes locked on mine. His smile was gone, replaced by something darker, colder. "No," he murmured. "This is just beginning." He didn't resist as they cuffed him. Neither did Karen, though she screamed until her voice broke. Eddie fought like a wild animal, but 3 officers dragged him down. And just like that, the people who had stolen my life were the ones being marched out in chains. I should have felt victorious. But as the station slowly returned to order, I couldn't shake Tom's final words. "Just beginning." Jenny touched my shoulder, pulling me back. "We'll go to the DA now. This is enough to start the case. You've done it." "Ab." I nodded, but my eyes stayed fixed on the door, where they'd been let out. Somewhere deep inside, I knew Tom wasn't bluffing. He had layers, backups, allies, maybe secrets, even Jenny hadn't considered, and I couldn't afford to underestimate him again. That night, as I sat alone in Jenny's office with the city lights bleeding through the blinds, I played the recording one more time. Tom's voice filled the room, arrogant and venomous. I clenched my fists. I had won a battle, but the war was still far from over, and I would be ready. The news broke like wildfire. By the next morning, every Cleveland outlet had plastered the story across their front pages. Greyhound station chaos. Family accused of murder. Frame up. The video clips grainy cell phone recordings of Eddie lunging, Karen shrieking, and Tom standing stiff, while his own voice damned him spread online faster than anyone could contain. For 2 years, I had been a ghost, forgotten, branded a killer. Overnight, my name was everywhere. this time followed by the word exonerated. Jenny warned me not to bask in it. This is the opening shot, Ab, not the finish line. They'll lawyer up. They'll deny, twist, stall Tom especially. He knows how to turn influence into smokescreens. And she was right. Within 48 hours, Tom had posted bail. The papers called it a routine pretrial release, but I knew better. The man was already maneuvering, trying to reframe the narrative. He went on a local radio show, his voice syrupy smooth, claiming he was the victim of a smear campaign. He painted me as a bitter old man, seeking revenge. He called the recording a fabrication. But there was fear in his eyes. You could see it if you knew where to look. Jenny doubled down, filing motions, stacking evidence, subpoenaing financial records, the spreadsheet, the transfers, the recordings piece by piece. The case was building. The DA's office, once reluctant, now had the scent of blood in the water. Prosecutors loved nothing more than a high-profile takedown. Still, Tom wasn't going quietly. One night, as I left Jenny's office, I noticed a black sedan idling across the street. Its headlights flicked on as I walked to my car, then off again. The same thing happened the next night and the one after. They weren't subtle. They wanted me to know I was being watched. Jenny tightened security, but the message was clear. Tom had allies, and they weren't afraid of intimidation. Stay calm, she told me. The more desperate they get, the more mistakes they'll make. And she was right again. The first crack came from Karen, locked in county jail, stripped of her phone and her freedom. She broke faster than I expected. Her attorney approached the DA with a deal testimony in exchange for leniency. Within a week, she was spilling everything. The late-night meeting where they planned the frame, the payments from Tom's company, the lies they rehearsed for the trial. Her words lit the fuse. With Karen's cooperation, Eddie's bravado crumbled. He tried to act tough in interrogations, but when confronted with her testimony and the recordings, he buckled. He confessed, stumbling over himself, to blame Tom as the mastermind. Tom, of course, denied everything. He smirked in court, whispered to his lawyers, and strutted out of hearings, like nothing could touch him. He still had money. He still had friends. But his armor was cracking, and the whole city could see it. The trial began 6 months later, in the same courthouse where I had once been condemned. Walking through those doors again felt like reopening a wound, but this time I wasn't the defendant. I was the witness, sat on the stand, my voice steady as I recounted everything. The night of my arrest, the months in prison, the betrayal etched on Karen's smirk. The jury watched me closely, their eyes soft with something I hadn't felt in years' belief. Then the recordings played. Tom's threats, Karen's laughter, Eddie's drunken bragging. The jury leaned forward, hanging on every word, and when Karen herself took the stand, her voice trembling as she admitted what they'd done. The room shifted for the first time. Tom looked cornered. Still, he fought. His lawyers argued. The recordings were doctored, that Karen was lying to save herself, that Eddie was unreliable. They painted me as vengeful, unstable, but the evidence piled higher, brick by brick, until even the smoothest spin couldn't cover it. The climax came when Jenny unveiled the spreadsheet, the cold hard numbers that showed Carl's payoff, the money trail, leading straight to Tom's accounts. She walked the jury through it step by step, her voice clear, unyielding. When the verdict finally came, it was like the world exhaled. Guilty, Tom. Marlowe, once untouchable, smug, and certain of his invincibility, was sentenced to life without parole for conspiracy and framing me for murder. Eddie received 20 years. Karen, thanks to her testimony, got 10. As the gavel fell, I felt something I hadn't in years. Not joy, not triumph. Something quieter. Something heavier. Relief reporters swarmed outside the courthouse, shoving microphones in my face, asking how it felt. I told them the truth. It doesn't feel like victory. I said, it feels like survival. But later that night, sitting alone in my apartment, I remembered Tom's words in the garage. This is just beginning. And I wondered, was he right? Because even behind bars, men like him cast long shadows. I closed my eyes, the memory of handcuffs still biting into my wrists, and whispered to myself the same promise I had made in prison. Never again. Never again will I let them take my life from me. In the weeks after the verdict, Cleveland felt like a city I didn't recognize anymore. People who once crossed the street to avoid me now stopped to shake my hand, murmur apologies, or whisper that they had always believed me deep down. Shopkeepers smiled, neighbors waved, strangers at diners picked up my tab. On the surface, it was vindication, but beneath it, something darker stirred. I would walk down Euclid Avenue at dusk and swear I felt eyes on me. The black sedan that had shadowed me before the trial vanished, but in its place were whispers. A man in a bar, murmuring about friends of Tom's who didn't like loose ends. A letter slipped under my door with no return address. You may have won the trial, but the game isn't over. Jenny told me to ignore it. They're rattling cages, Ab. Nothing more. Tom's in prison. Hell die there. You're free. The word tasted foreign. Freedom didn't feel like waking up without bars. It felt like waiting for the next shoe to drop. Every creak in the hallway of my apartment, every engine idling too long on the street below, made my pulse spike. I carried the weight of 2 years wrongfully stolen, and even with justice served, I couldn't lay it down. One evening, I drove to Lake Erie's edge, to the same pier I'd stood on as a kid, skipping stones. The lake stretched endless, dark, and indifferent. I sat on the cold bench, staring at the horizon, and thought about the people I had loved. Once the family I trusted, the relatives who had turned me into a monster to save themselves. They were locked away now, rotting in cells, but their betrayal still lived inside me, sharp as glass. I pulled the small recorder from my pocket, the same one that had carried their downfall, and pressed play. Tom's voice spilled into the night air. You won't walk away at all. For a long time, I just listened to his arrogance, to his certainty, to the sound of the man who had tried to erase me. Then I clicked it off, slipped it back into my jacket, and whispered into the darkness. I walked away. Tom, and you didn't. The lake breeze carried the words out over the water, and for the first time in years, I almost felt peace. Almost. Because deep down, I knew the truth. Revenge doesn't end with the verdict. It lingers, haunting you like a shadow you can't outrun. And sometimes when the night grows too quiet, I wonder if Tom was right, if this was just the beginning, and if it is, then God help whoever tries to take what's mine again. The end.